Hi folks, the purpose of this brief video is to provide a general overview of the scene analysis essay assignment for you. And in this particular assignment, what we're going to do is look at the intersection of theme and the elements of film that we've been discussing in class. Let's just start by discussing the general purpose and the audience for this particular assignment. It's going to be a little different than your last one. In the last assignment, the film review, you were writing to either recommend or not recommend a film, and you were writing for a college newspaper. So in particular, you were writing for the Johnson & Wales student body, and you were publishing your film review in the Johnson & Wales newspaper for Johnson & Wales students. Your general purpose this time is still to argue, just like you did in your last assignment, but this time what you're doing is you're arguing your interpretation of theme. In other words, you're identifying what you see as a central point in the overall film, and you're looking at how this theme is continued in the 3 to 4 minute segment of this film that you've chosen to analyze. What you're doing is you're arguing your interpretation and what you see as the importance of that theme in your paper. Your audience this time is very different than last. So last time you were writing for a Johnson & Wales student newspaper, so a lot of you took a very informal tone, a very conversational tone, and that was fine for that type of assignment. However, this time your audience is much more formal. In particular, this time you're writing for academics, scholars, film critics, professors, and students who are academic scholars and film critics in training, much like yourselves. And one thing that you're going to have to keep in mind is that this audience that you're writing for this time, unlike last paper, has seen this film, and they're familiar with all of its contents, its plot, how the different elements are being used in the film. So in other words, there's not going to be anything for you to explain in regard to the background of this, or at least not very much, like you did last time. This time you're arguing what you see as the importance of the theme and how it's connected to your particular scene that you're looking at, and how all these things are connected to the different film elements that you're planning to analyze. So before you begin writing, what you're going to have to do is think about, in the scene that you've chosen, in that 3 to 4 minute segment, go back to your screen matrix assignment and look at all the notes that you have there, and decide, of all the different elements that you've looked at and all the things you noticed in that scene, which 3 or so are of the most importance. You could look at things like characterization, and we'll talk about all these in a little more detail in a moment. The different types of camera shots that are used, the point of view that is used, mise-en-scène, set design, lighting, sound, and costuming. And you can organize your paper in different ways, and that's actually going to be discussed in the next video. So you could choose probably 3 to 5 of these items to discuss, because some of these you can discuss in connection to one another, like the camera shots and point of view that we have here. So if you're going to examine characterization, what you're going to do is actually look at a little bit of the plot here. You're examining the things that the character do, their actions, and what you would do is talk about why those actions are significant and how they reveal some aspect of the theme that you've chosen. So in a moment I'm going to talk about the idea of entrapment and closure in the scene that we watched from 12 Monkeys. So if you were talking about James Cole, what you would do is you'd think about, in that scene, what were some of the things that James Cole did that illustrated that idea of enclosure and entrapment. You could also look at the things that he says, or other characters say, that illustrate the idea of enclosure and entrapment. You could also look at the objects that are in the scenes, that are placed in the scenes, and think about how they symbolically convey the idea of enclosure and entrapment. So what we're doing there is we're looking at objects that are essentially closely associated with specific characters. So it could have been associated with James, Jeffrey, whomever you want to look at in that particular scene. but essentially what you're doing is you're looking to see how objects are closely associated with a particular character. So let's back up a moment and let's review exactly what a theme is. Now, you probably heard this term before, most likely in a literature class, and probably most definitely in high school, if you haven't taken a literature class in college yet. So the theme is the central or dominant idea of a work. In this particular case, we're discussing a film, so it's the central or dominant idea of a film. So the way that you can think about this is when you've gotten to the end of the film, either you're walking out of the theater or you're turning off your TV set. In one sentence, what was it that you think that the filmmaker wanted you to understand? What was that one main point, that one main idea that you feel like he or she wanted you to understand? That's what we mean by theme. And what you're going to do is take that theme, like the idea of enclosure and entrapment, for instance, and make connections between the theme and the different film elements that we've been examining. For instance, in this particular image here, what we see is James Cole, and he's inside of the mental institution. This is 1990. He's been sent back from the year 2034 in an attempt to stop the organization 12 Monkeys that actually spread the virus that killed everyone in 1997. And like we discussed in class, you know, if one of us went back in time and showed up in 1990 and we're saying the world is going to end and everyone is going to die, much like James Cole here, we would probably end up in a straitjacket and inside of a mental institution. So how does this particular frame illustrate the ideas of enclosure and entrapment? Well, there's a couple things. We could talk about, in relation to characterization, some of the things that James may have said in this scene, some of the things that he did, and then we can look at objects that are closely associated with him here. In the background, we have these two archways, and when we think of an archway, we usually think of like an opening, or sometimes openings like that, like windows or doors, we connect those or associate them with opportunities. Well, in this case, there's no opportunity at all, and no movement allowed, because what we see on each of these doorways are bars. So this idea of enclosure and entrapment is once again emphasized in this particular frame, just like it is throughout much of the film. Another thing that the filmmaker does here is, you'll notice the angle of the camera shot here is sort of off kilter. That's very significant in relationship to the point of view that we, the audience, have, because what the filmmaker has done is sort of made us, as the viewer, feel off kilter, sort of much of the same way that James is feeling in this particular shot. So the cameraman creates that particular angle to make us feel these things. Of course, the set designer also thought about this idea of enclosure and entrapment as well. So you can see how these things come together to form this particular theme that we're looking at. And if we move on to this next scene, you got a lot of the same things going on here. Now, again, what we're doing in this particular essay that you're writing is we're making connections between what we see as a theme and the different types of film elements. Well, in this particular frame, this is when James first comes up to the surface. This particular shot is very, very important, because for the first time, and we don't know how long, perhaps a long time, James has been allowed to be outside of his cell, and he's on the surface, and you would think that this would be an opportunity to feel free. But you have to remember that what happened is, after everyone died in 1997, the animals took over the surface of the earth again, just as they did before human beings appeared. So this particular shot is very, very significant. If you look at the mise-en-scène, right over James's shoulder is the bear, and what's really important is the way that everything is organized in the particular frame. James is in the front, we see that expression on his face, and the bear, which is up higher than James and appears to be dominant, is essentially communicated to us anyway that this bear is in control of this particular situation here. So once again, we get this idea of enclosure and entrapment in a space in which he should have felt free. In this particular frame, this is when James is leaving that that living space beneath the surface of the earth where human beings have been forced to move to, and he's sort of in this in-between space headed to the surface. Once again, we have this sort of long tube-like area, and it encloses him inside of it. So you got the idea of enclosure here again. Now, if you want to look at the significance of objects, each of the things he carries here, cases, what do those types of cases do? They enclose objects on the inside. So they're symbolic of the very situation in which James finds himself. So hopefully from some of these discussions, you've been getting the feeling of exactly what it is that you're supposed to do in this paper. So you're going to identify a theme, take some of the elements, and talk about how some of these elements illustrate the point of that theme in those particular scenes, or that scene that you've chosen. Now, there's some things that you need to remember when you're writing this particular paper. Well, first of all, it needs to be 4 full pages up to 6 full pages, just as the instructions state. But you also want to be sure that you're doing some of these things or not doing particular things. And one of those not doing things, what you want to do is you want to avoid slang. So in the last paper, perhaps it was okay at times for you guys to use slang terms and things like that, but this time our audience is much more formal and you can't do that. You also can't use first person, so you're going to have to not use I. You have to find another way. Can't use personal pronouns, so no you, your, our, ours, as in O-U-R-S, we, us, me, my, mine. Can't do that. All these things are considered too informal. And in the last paper, a lot of you wanted to use you and your a lot. What you're going to have to do to avoid that this time is when you're speaking to your reader, use terms like the viewer might see that blah 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 blah, or one may feel blah 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 blah. Those type things, those types of phrases. So you're speaking to a highly educated audience this time, so this means that your language must also be highly educated. Again, one thing you want to remember, that what you're doing in this particular paper is you're arguing your interpretation of the scene. You're arguing what you see as the theme and how and what connections you see between the theme and the different film elements. So one thing you cannot do is simply summarize the plot. You don't want to do that, remember, because your audience has already seen the film. They know what happens. What you're supposed to do is argue your interpretation of this film. And ultimately, what we'd like to happen by the end of your paper is for your audience to feel enlightened. In other words, after reading your paper, we would like to hope that they see this film in a way that they didn't consider before. And ultimately, that's what we want our goal to be, and we would like to happen. One thing you need to be sure that you're doing as well is using present tense verbs when relating the events of the story. In other words, instead of saying James made his way to the surface, blah blah blah, it would be James makes his way to the surface, he removes the manhole cover, and then he exits into the snow, instead of using all the past tense verbs. So be sure that you're doing that as you relate the different events of the story. If you haven't done so already, be sure that you print out the instructions for the assignment. Be sure that you read them carefully. Make sure you understand everything that you're supposed to do, and of course, if you don't, be sure you ask me about it. Also, take some time to examine the rubric that I'm going to use to grade you, to make sure that you understand exactly what it is that I'm looking for when I grade. In the next video, we'll be discussing organization.